All right. So, welcome everyone to our History Hour for February. My name's Toby Crawford. I'm the Vice President and Communications Coordinator for the Sullivan Sorrento Historical Society. And tonight's presentation is it's a story of a well-to-do Boston lady who went down to Alabama as a teacher, and she found one of her pupils there, the young Theodora, very eager to please, and brought her back north as her maid when she married, thus beginning some 40 years of virtual enslavement. And they live in Sorrento for part of that. So it's a very troubling story, and here tonight to present on the troubling story of Dora Jones and the couple from Sorrento is Sam Younger. Sam, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Let me make sure everything's working. Everybody can hear me. So, those of you who don't know me, I've been doing lots of Sorrento history for a bunch of years. I have a little blog, and I always like at the beginning of these to recognize the Sorrento and Sullivan communities, especially the Sullivan Sorrento Historical Society, and put a plug in. If you are not a member of the society, you may want to look at the website and join. And there are some new initiatives, especially the Uran House, which Gary Edwards is very uh, uh, who's pushing that project along to try to get the Uran House up and running. So tonight, I just want to tell the story of Dora Jones and the couple from Sorrento. And I thought since it's Black History Month, it was a good time to talk about Dora and how she connects to Sorrento. In 1947, 80 years before, 80 years after emancipation, the story of the modern day slave named Dora Jones made headlines around the country. But when I looked at the research, I didn't find anything connecting her to Maine in that reporting. So tonight, let me just take you through my research and how it led me to Dora's story and the couple who were accused of keeping her in involuntary servitude. And just so you know, before tasting freedom, Dora endured countless indignities for decades, and then during a sensational trial, she recounted how she suffered physical and psychological abuse at the hands of this couple, who also happened to be former summer residents of Sorrento. And as with other Sorrento history, I'm sure there are others who might have additional insights or relative information. So if anyone knows anything more, please let me know. But if you're interested in reading a little bit more, I wrote a bunch of blog posts about Dora, and there's some other links to a lot of other research that's been done about her in the past. So Dora's name burst onto headlines around the country 78 years ago this month in February. It was on an evening, Tuesday, February 25th, 1947, that U.S. Marshals in San Diego arrived at a modest home located in Coronado, California. You probably know Coronado, California, as the location of an historic hotel called the Hotel del Coronado, featured in many movies. The newly built house there was owned by a couple who had recently moved there from Boston to retire. And federal authorities were there to serve an arrest warrant on Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Ingalls on the charges of keeping their maid in involuntary servitude and slavery. Also detained that night as a material witness was their domestic servant named Dora Jones. And when I began this research, like many of you tonight, probably, I'd never heard about this story in the headline or anything about the lives of Dora or the Ingalls. So let me rewind a bit and let me take you through how I stumbled upon them and their connections to Sorrento. Shortly before Sturgis Haskins died, who was the original historian of Sorrento and one of the founders of the Historical Society, Sturgis mentioned to me in an email that a family in Sorrento had kept a slave in their home. And needless to say, I wanted to learn a little bit more about this anecdote, but unfortunately, he passed away before I could ask him anything more about the story. And with him went lots of good history about uh, Sorrento and Sullivan. There was another little bit in Catherine Herson's Sorrento history book that many of you may know. Uh, there was a small clue that she gave, and I followed on. And while she provided no detail, she did mention that the couple who owned Blueberry Lodge, which is a cottage in town, was infamous for keeping a slave girl. So I began my research by reviewing the history of the owners of that cottage. In 1886, when Sorrento was first developed, a Boston architect named Frank Hill Smith designed and built two nearly identical cottages on the same street in town. And Eva Smith Cochran purchased the first cottage. She and her husband were already owners of a home along the water in Bar Harbor, but after a steamship ride across the bay to the new resort, Mrs. Cochran, who was the heir of a large carpet manufacturer in New York, in Yonkers, New York, she evidently fell in love with the hidden charms of Sorrento. And in 1887, she bought one of the cottages, and thus beginning her family's multi-generational stay in Sorrento. A few months later, Daniel Lamont, who's pictured there on the left, who at the time was serving in Washington, D.C. as President Grover Cleveland's private secretary, or what we would probably call today the chief of staff in the White House. And later he was the Secretary of War in the second Cleveland administration. He also heard about the new resort, and in 1888, he purchased the other matching cottage. And in the days before there were 911 dispatchers and when mail was delivered to post offices and people went to go pick it up, there were no need for street addresses, even though there were many streets in town that had names. So instead, as was the custom in many small communities, houses were identified by their owners or sometimes by another nickname chosen by their owners. And Eva Cochran chose to name her cottage Tasseltop, and the Lamonts called theirs Blueberry Lodge. The Lamont family would enjoy summers at Blueberry Lodge for nearly 50 years until 1935, when Lamont's daughter, Frances Lamont Robbins, sold the family's house. And the second owners of Blueberry Lodge were a couple named Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Ingalls, a prominent Massachusetts lawyer, and his wife. At the time, I didn't know what I was looking for. And as history goes, sometimes you don't know what to look for until you find it. And some things that seem easy are easy to miss. But uh, one of those reasons was Mrs. Ingalls was known by different names during her lifetime, which made researching the story about Dora a bit confusing. She was known by her maiden name, which was Mira Kimball, but she was also known as Elizabeth and sometimes Bess or Bessie, a nickname that her husband used. So tonight, I'll try to simply refer to her as Mrs. Ingalls. Around the same time, in a bit of unrelated research, I had turned my attention to another house in town with a nickname that had always sort of confused me, and one that I thought could be related to the story of the slave girl. In a book that Larry Lewis, another local Sorrento resident, wrote about the time in the 1970s, he referred to a house in town as the former slave quarters. And he also wrote that he remembered pieces of old tourist camps being hauled by the owners across town to be joined at the rear of the house. And over the years that I spent growing up in town, I seem to have faint recollections of others referring to the cottage as quarters, but I never really asked anyone why that name existed. I only knew it was the house where my friends, the Gazis, spent their summer. Diana Gazis is a one of the selectmen in town now. So I began to look at the land records to see if these could provide any clues as to why someone would give it a nickname that was really reminiscent of an era before Sorrento was even founded and one not typically associated with New England, even. And it was this research that helped me piece together the threads of the complicated and complex and difficult story. And as you will learn, those records led me to the link between this cottage and Blueberry Lodge. But what I wasn't able to ever answer, and probably uh, don't think I ever will, was why anyone thought it was appropriate to use that name or who first associated the name with the cottage. And so while the slave quarters nickname has probably faded now into the past, I think it's important to acknowledge this history and that the name was once commonly used in town. The other important thing I hope you will take away from tonight is the history of the woman who you'll learn a little bit more about tonight. Dora Jones's life made me reflect on the many people of all races who really worked endless hours while others were on vacation. And while Sorrento in the early days was probably more rustic than Bar Harbor, there were lots of domestic servants employed in the large cottages and at the hotel. And while the names of many of Sorrento's summer visitors are well known and the memories of many local residents who helped to build the town are also remembered, the names of those other individuals who worked in town are really lost to history. So uh, it's good to remember that when they came to Sorrento, it wasn't a place that they visited to relax and enjoy vacation pursuits. They were there to work. And I'm really glad I'm able to put a face to one of those forgotten names and can share that history of Dora Jones, this African American woman who I estimate spent around 10 summers living and working in Sorrento. And as you'll learn, most of that time without any compensation. Remember that when I began this research, I didn't know anything about Dora's story and only that the little white house had once been called slave quarters. And so I started out, as I do most of my research, by trying to trace the owners of that house to see what I could find. And I traced back in time, peeling the onion from the current owners. When I spoke to Diana Gazis, she related that when they purchased the house from Reverend Powell Dawley and his wife in the late 1960s, the name of the house that was passed along to them was not slave quarters, but rather the anchorage, presumably because of, as she said, there was an abandoned boat anchor that sat in the front yard, as well as its location across the street from what remains of an older dock, and at one point was the back door of Sorrento and where goods and things were transported into the hotel. So when I researched the previous owner, I learned that Reverend Dawley had been an Episcopal minister who taught at General Theological Seminary in New York. He'd been the dean of St. Luke's Cathedral in Portland, Maine, and Reverend Dawley, I believe, also served for a time as the summer minister at the Church of the Redeemer in Sorrento. Dawley's bought the house and land in 1963, and my guess is that they may have needed the house after they lost access to the summer rectory at the church. And it was during that short period of time between 1963 and 1968 when the Dawleys made renovations and added a few more rooms on the rear of the house. They connected those to the main unit with a boardwalk. that's still there. And my other guess is that the Dawleys were prompted to sell the house after only owning it for about 5 years to raise funds for a retirement home that they bought in Brunswick, Maine, where uh, the minister died 20 years later. Since I couldn't connect the slave quarter names to those owners, I continued back in time and I found that before the Dawleys, the house was owned by Marguerite Ridgely, who had purchased it in 1948. Marguerite was the widow of Julian Ridgely and the niece of Edward Morrill. And the Ridgeleys lived in Baltimore, where Julian had been a prominent lawyer. He had died in 1939, and his family had been associated and built the Hampton Mansion and Plantation, which is north of Baltimore in the 18th century. And while this estate was well known to have slaves and slave quarters, I didn't find anything in Mrs. Ridgely's history that might have caused her to name the little house in Sorrento slave quarters. Let me just tell you a little bit about Mrs. Ridgely and how her being the niece of Congressman Edward Morrell uh, is another significant part of Sorrento's history that I only have really a short time to summarize. But Edward Morrell was married to Louise Bouvier Drexel, and she not only had the middle name of Bouvier that you may recognize, but she was the daughter of Francis Drexel, an influential Philadelphia financier. And Colonel Morrell and his wife owned a large estate in Bar Harbor, uh, and the grounds of which are now house the Jackson Labs. And Morrill also bought Calf Island off the coast of Sorrento in 1911. Both he and his wife were devout Catholics, and together they funded numerous charities in Bar Harbor, including the Catholic Church and a Catholic school for children. But Louise was also the sister of Mother Catherine Drexel, who, after her death, was the second American-born saint, and she was canonized in 2000 by Pope John Paul II. And together, these sisters made numerous gifts from their inheritances to support educational institutions for both African American and Native American children. And the pair also devoted time and resources to other projects in support of racial justice. One of their better known educational institutions they endowed was Xavier University of Louisiana in New Orleans, which is the only historically Black Roman Catholic institution of higher education in the United States. Following the death of Colonel Morrell at the age of 54, uh, his wife, Louisa, spent a large amount of her time on Calf Island, despite having a large estate in Bar Harbor. And Louise Morrell lived until 1945. And because she and her husband never had any children, in her will, she left Calf Island to her devoted secretary Leona Colby. Also included in her estate were two houses in Sorrento, and those she left to her niece, Marguerite Ridgely. And those cottages stood on Waukegan Avenue, just past the library. And Mrs. Morrell, it's legend has it, had a priest that would stay in those cottages and go out to Calf Island, where he would have mass for her every morning on the chapel on Calf Island. And the deed records indicate that after inheriting those houses, she purchased a third property next door in 1948. And that was the little white house next door. And she bought those from Alfred and Elizabeth Ingalls of Lynn, Massachusetts. So while Marguerite bought the property with a little white house to accompany her other adjacent homes just down the block, I couldn't find anything to tie her to the slave quarter names. But what it did point out was that the Ingalls owned not only uh, Blueberry Lodge, but also the slave quarters. And Still not knowing anything about the story behind the couple, that Catherine Herson had said were famous for keeping a slave girl. All I knew was that at that point was that the Ingalls had purchased the land where this house was located from the town of Sorrento in 1938, and that their deed makes no mention of any building existing on the land. So it appeared at that point that it was the Ingalls who first erected the small structure on the land. And some people have said that it was a former motel unit that was brought over. I'm not quite sure uh, where it originated. And it was only later that the significance of the year the Ingalls sold the land to Mrs. Ridgely, 1948, just 1 year after their arrest in California, stood out for me. But uh, knowing about the publicity about the case at the time, it's maybe certain that Mrs. Ridgely may have been aware of their story when she purchased the home. So, with that connection made, I turned my attention to researching the couple, which after only a couple hours, one night while I was sitting at my computer, quickly led me to the national headlines and the disturbing details that accompanied their case. Their names popped up in headline stories that uh, appeared around the country in 1947 when U.S. Marshals in San Diego were arrived at their house to place them under arrest and put Dora into protective custody. One of the first things the articles revealed was that their arrest had been several months in the making. 4 months earlier, in October of 1946, there had been an initial visit to a police station, that one in Berkeley, California, where the Ingalls had stopped to stay with one of their daughters. And it was on that stopover where their daughter Helen uh, uh, told authorities that Dora had come forward to tell them that she'd been forced to spend nights sleeping in the car rather than in the hotels that they were staying at. And it was Helen and her husband who decided to bring their parents' behavior to the attention of local law enforcement. So that night at the police station, despite Mrs. Ingalls threatening Dora in front of authorities, the couple and their maid were permitted to leave without any charges filed. Local police concluded that it was simply a case of domestic dispute, and the Ingalls continued their trip from Berkeley onto San Diego. When they arrived in San Diego, the Ingalls moved into the famous Hotel Del Coronado for a few months while they waited for the construction on their house to finish. And it was later alleged that it was there that they again made Dora sleep in the family car parked on the street, even though the hotel had rooms set aside for servants and had no restrictions against African Americans using those rooms. So the first act of this tragedy had taken place 4 months earlier when the Ingalls' daughter brought Dora's plight to the attention of local police. And the second act, as we'll learn, came with the investigation arrest of the Ingalls by federal agents in February of 1947 on charges that not only had they mistreated their domestic servant, but for years had never paid her for her work. And now that the Ingalls had transported Dora across state lines, the U.S. Justice Department had jurisdiction to charge them with violating the constitutional prohibitions against slavery. And they were able to place Dora into protective custody. I just want to take a few moments to talk a bit about domestic servants in America. Of course, after the Civil War and well into the 20th century, household servants were never well paid, but they were common, and men and women of all races were employed in many middle class as well as wealthy households. There are lots of researchers, including sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois and social historian Lucy Maynard Salmon, who conducted studies on servants. And While class differences were obvious, Salmon included one bit of practical advice to keep in mind to help lessen their servants' sense of social inferiority, and that was, quote, "What domestics as a class desire is the opportunity of living their own lives in their own way." Of course, it was always assumed that you would pay your domestics, and in summer communities like Sorrento, the help often accompanied the families on their vacations to continue their work. And while I certainly don't remember any servants in the 1960s, in the decades before that, I'm sure they were more common. I'm reading right now a book about Clara Spence, who had a house on the harbor in Sorrento. And in the early 1900s, she was accompanied by several servants, including a Chinese man who cooked, as well as several Irish maids. And for both new immigrants and Black Americans, these low-wage jobs had a low barrier of entry, and many families in both the North and in the South could afford the luxury of hiring one or two domestic servants to handle kitchen duties, washing, and other tasks around the house. And when we think of the Great Migration that brought many blacks from the South to the cities of the North, we often assume that they were drawn by the opportunity to fill jobs in factories and other industries. But for Black women with little or no education, the prospects for those jobs was a lot more difficult. And one surprising thing I learned recently in looking at some of the research at the time was that the percentage of both native-born white women and immigrant white women employed in domestic service decreased tremendously in the early part of the 20th century, likely as their families moved up the economic ladder and they either did not need to work or moved into other types of employment. But the opposite was true for Black women. And for them, domestic servant jobs were the only choice for work oftentimes. And rather than decreasing, their percentages increased in that category in the early part of the 1900s. And some of the research at the time looked at the dynamics of those household relationships, and lots of other publications and books and popular magazines focused on the servant problem, which covered a range of issues, from what to call your domestic servant to how they should dress and how to retain good help and how to employ methods from Christian benevolence to scientific methods to better motivate household workers. But many of those articles danced around the issue of race. One example I found in 1912 was a Lady Home Journal article where one woman's theory of how she used these new theories in her home uh, included a fascinating quote from her black maid named Katie, who, after being confronted with some new efficiency measures, smartly pointed out to her employer the dilemma from her side that while I can do more work by doing what you say and easier too, but it don't make no more pay for me. And even when I hurry up and get done sooner, I don't get no more time to myself. Seems as if when I do more, I ought to get more, but I can't quite figure it out. So following their arrest, the Ingalls were released on $2,500 bond, and a grand jury began to hear evidence collected by the FBI against the first Americans since the late 1800s to be charged with keeping a slave in violation of the 14th Amendment. As their case moved through the courts, more details about their life emerged, uh, and more about the relationship between Mrs. Ingalls and Dora. It would turn out that not being paid for her labor was only the tip of their troubling relationship. Some of the first information released to the press was the story of how Dora first met and began working for Mrs. Ingalls. In 1905, Mrs. Ingalls, then an unmarried 20-year-old recent college graduate, known by her maiden name of Mira Kimball, took a job working in rural Alabama as a missionary teacher. She needed household help and hired a then teenage Dora as her maid. 2 years later, when she returned to Washington, D.C. to marry Walter Harmon and later had her first child, Dora moved north to work with the family. Dora, it was learned, had also told the investigators that her work days would typically start at 4 a.m. and last until 10 at night. After divorcing her first husband and marrying Alfred Ingalls, Dora also accompanied Mrs. Ingalls when she moved to a Boston suburb, but only after what was described in the papers as threats of prosecution or commitment to an institution. At this point, no additional details about their life together or anything else behind these threats were leaked, but authorities did say that it was around this time in the 1920s that Mrs. Ingalls stopped paying Dora for her work and supported the grand jury's charge of violating Dora's civil rights by keeping her in illicit servitude. 3 months later, when federal prosecutors opened their case before a jury in California, the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators. And interest in the black community was especially high. Local civic groups such as the NAACP and black churches had taken an interest in Dora's life story. And a jury of 9 men and 3 women were seated to hear the case, none of whom were black, by the way, uh, to hear the evidence in the case against the couple, which the lead prosecutor ominously described in his opening statement as a psychological chain of steel. Although there were no black jurors, crowds of African Americans lined up each day for a chance to sit in the courtroom, and the trial was covered widely in the African American newspapers around the country, such as the Los Angeles Sentinel and the Boston Guardian. Over the course of a 4 week trial, new details about Dora's life with Mrs. Ingalls were revealed, and the case against the couple would then be corroborated by eyewitness accounts, including most dramatically from Mrs. Ingalls' own children, and eventually by Dora herself when she took the stand as the star witness. Meanwhile, the defense would claim that Dora was simply more of a protege than a servant, and that Dora's testimony was not credible since she was very impressionable, and it was the FBI and the U.S. attorneys who've been filling her imagination with extraordinary allegations. On one of the first days of the trial, prosecutors asked the judge to revoke the bond he had set and jail the couple after reports that Mrs. Ingalls had assaulted and threatened one of the witnesses, a friend of one of their daughters, who had been slammed against the wall, cursed at, and allegedly called a dirty little rat. When defense counsel was unable to convince Judge Weinberg that Mrs. Ingalls had regained her composure, when defense counsel was able to convince Judge Weinberg that she had regained her composure, he ruled against putting the couple back in jail and continued the trial after issuing a stern warning. On July 2nd, their youngest daughter, Helen Roberts, was called to the witness stand. If the testimony of the jury would hear about Dora's years of abuse at the hands of the Ingalls was not tragic enough, the involvement of their daughters in bringing the story to light and having to testify against their parents was equally compelling and sad. And the daughters were able to substantiate many of Dora's later claims, especially those accusing their parents of being psychologically and physically abusive. While Mrs. Ingalls wept into her handkerchief, Helen told the jury how her mother had called her a Judas for testifying in the case. She also testified that her mother often scolded Dora, calling her a moron and a criminal, and that she had witnessed her mother hit and scratch Dora and once even pushed her down a set of stairs. On another occasion, she told the jury she had seen her father standing over Dora, beating her with his fists. Another thing she recalled for the jury was even more perplexing. She said that when she was a child, her mother told her that Dora had been a criminal who had been paroled to the family, but that her mother never told her what that crime was. The prosecutors called Dora's sister, Myrtle, and her brother, Arthur, as witnesses, and they were able to report that Dora had last visited them in 1924. And one of the reasons she had not been able to visit more often, they told the jury, was because she had done wrong. And as she said, she had dealings with her mistress's first husband. These witnesses set the stage for Dora to take the stand, where, for the first time, she would reveal to the world the full story of her life with the Ingalls. A life where not only had she not been paid for decades, but one where she had endured years of abuse, both physical and psychological. In brief, the story of abuse Dora laid out for the jury began when Mrs. Ingalls married her first husband, Walter Harmon. And it was then and when Dora moved from Alabama to Washington, D.C. to take care of the couple's baby. And Dora revealed that while they lived in Washington, D.C., she became pregnant herself after what appeared to be a consensual affair with Bessie's first husband. At first, Dora lied and told Bessie the father was the milkman, but eventually she confessed that it had been Mr. Harmon who had gotten her pregnant. Enraged at the deception, Dora told how Bessie used physical and psychological intimidation to have Dora terminate the pregnancy. Dora testified that afterwards, she was repeatedly warned that she would have a jail sentence hanging over her head for committing adultery and for murdering the baby. After Dora agreed to what was then an illegal abortion, uh, Bessie divorced Harmon and returned to Massachusetts with their daughter and the obedient Dora in tow. And it was there that she married Alfred Ingalls in 1917 and moved to Lynn, Massachusetts. Mrs. Ingalls' second husband, Alfred, practiced law and served in the state legislature of Massachusetts. And at one point early in her second marriage, Dora told the jury that Mrs. Ingalls had suffered a miscarriage, but blamed her for losing the baby. Dora said Mrs. Ingalls threatened her with, quote, when she was in hell, there would be two babies holding their arms up out to her for what she had done. Mrs. Ingalls was eventually able to have another child, and Dora continued to work for the family and help raise both girls. She also told jurors about the physical threats and beatings and emotional abuse the couple inflicted on her during that time. She also confirmed how she was kept isolated when she was working without pay, and that Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls allowed her to return to Alabama only one single time. The tragic story of Bessie and Alfred's cruel treatment of Dora and Dora's decades of involuntary servitude also extended into the drama within the Ingalls family, a drama that eventually led Dora to confide her stories to their daughter, who then found the courage to report her parents' behavior to the authorities. Remarkably, the current owner of the Sorrento house has what appears to be a carbon copy of an undated letter that Alfred Ingalls wrote just before their federal arraignment in the spring of 1947. And that's where he refers to his wife by the name of Bessie. He doesn't say who he was writing to, but he does talk about the role his daughter Helen played in luring Dora away from her parents. It also confirms the battle within the family, which led to their behavior first being brought to the attention of authorities, as well as details about the visit to the police station in Berkeley. Notably, Ingalls argues that it was Dora who insisted on sleeping in the car and that their arrest was simply the result of the communist crowd attempting to stir up racial strife. Also, despite their arrest and likely trial, Alfred indicated in the letter that the couple expected to travel back east in a few months, possibly even to Maine during what would have been the summer of 1947, the summer that the trial was taking place. One of the prosecutors of the trial was a trailblazing woman assistant U.S. attorney in San Diego. When it was Dora's turn to take the stand as a star witness, much of the questioning was handled by Betty Marshall Graydon. She put into evidence testimony of Dora's having to sleep in the car when the family moved back to California. And during one dramatic point in the trial, she asked the members of the jury to inspect Dora's hands to decide whether, quote, they are the hands of a person who is a member of the family or whether they were the hands of a slave. After Dora's turn on the witness stand concluded, the prosecutors called Mrs. Engel's older daughter, Ruth. She testified that it was not until she was a teenager that her mother told her that it was her father's indiscretions that had led to her parents' divorce. She also said it was only years later that she learned that Dora was at the center of the affair. And she also confirmed that her mother made Dora work 7 days a week, often for 10 to 15 hours per day. When it was the defense attorney's turn, he attacked both daughters, accusing Helen of being a communist sympathizer and Ruth as an admirer of Hitler. They also called Mrs. Engels to tell her side of the story. She defended herself, arguing that Dora was, quote, never a slave or even a servant, but just one of us. On July 11th, in their closing arguments, the U.S. attorney portrayed Mrs. Engels as the controlling character. And while Mr. Engels was certainly lesser in authority, he was still culpable. The defense closing centered again on the argument that Dora was simply a member of the family and that a charge of slavery was simply preposterous. After Judge Weinberger sent the jury to deliberate, Dora left San Diego, where she had been staying under the protection of the U.S. Marshals, on a train to St. Louis, where she would live out the rest of her years with her sister. After only 30 minutes, the jury reached their first verdict and found Mrs. Engels guilty on all charges. However, they were not able to reach a verdict on Mr. Engels, and so the judge sent them back to continue deliberations. After 5 more hours, the jury remained deadlocked, and so the judge dismissed the jury and ordered the case closed against Mr. Engels. The judge then ordered that Mrs. Engels be taken into custody and sent to the San Diego County Jail to await sentencing. Despite arguments by her attorney and Mr. Engels, she was sent to jail, and the next morning, one newspaper reported described her as accustomed to having breakfast in bed. She awoke with neither her husband or Negro maid to serve her. After 10 days in the county jail, Mrs. Engels was brought back to the courtroom to face a possible sentence of 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Instead, Judge Weinberger sentenced her to a 3-year jail term, which he immediately suspended because of her age and physical condition. He also imposed 5 years of probation and a $2,500 fine. He also awarded Dora restitution for the lost wages of $6,000, a payment of close to $100,000 today. The court said that they had talked to Dora, and she indicated that this settlement would be fair, and despite her years of mistreatment, she bore no ill will toward the couple. By the time of their arrest and trial, the Engels had already sold Blueberry Lodge in Sorrento. That deed transfer was signed by the Engels in San Diego on November 15th, 1946, just weeks after their first encounter with police in Berkeley, California, and during the time when they were staying at the hotel in San Diego with Dora sleeping in the car. A few months later, the couple would be arrested after reports were verified of their treatment of Dora. We know from the Sorrento deed records that the Engels did not sell their other Sorrento property, the Little White House, to Mrs. Ridgely until July 1948, 1 year after the trial was over. So it seems that if they were going to return to Sorrento in 1947, as Mr. Engels indicates in his letter, they would have only had the slave quarters in which to stay. And given that the letter from around that time ended up in a box at the house, I wonder whether the couple really did make it back one or more times to Maine to wrap up the details of their property sales. While conducting the research, I discovered one interesting property transfer that the Ingalls made with another parcel of land that they owned in Gouldsboro. In November 1925, Mrs. Ingalls bought 65 acres of land in Gouldsboro, and this land is, as most of you know, just up Route 1 from Sorrento. It was purchased by Mrs. Ingalls 20 years before the couple bought Blueberry Lodge. A local newspaper account in 1933 indicates that the Ingalls were spending the summer there with their daughters in West Gouldsboro. This report was 2 years before they bought Blueberry Lodge and moved over to Sorrento. But there's one other disturbing twist revealed in the land records of that Gouldsboro property. On April 24th, 1931, Mrs. Ingalls sold and conveyed 3,000 square feet of this property to Dora Jones. However, the very next day, on April 25th, 1931, the deed records indicate that Dora Jones transferred the lot to Mr. Ingalls. So the mystery remains as to why Mrs. Ingalls sold a small parcel in Gouldsboro to Dora Jones and why it was transferred back to Mr. Ingalls the very next day. One possibility I've considered is that this may have been in an attempt, perhaps by the couple, to deceive Dora as early as 1931 by giving her a deed somehow as proof that she was being compensated for her work. Or maybe there was some other reason, such as a tax advantage that the Ingalls were attempting to gain by using a sale to Dora as an intermediary while eventually placing the property in the name of Alfred Ingalls. I just don't know. Regardless of the reason, it seems like this land transfer is one additional sad postscript to this story, with Dora listed as the owner of the plot in Gouldsboro for only 24 hours. If this was some sort of trick to deceive Dora, it's perhaps unsurprising. Given some of the other accounts during the trial, it was revealed that Mr. Ingalls had used Dora's signature as a bondsman in a case in Boston, in which he was named as a guardian in the estate of a mentally incapacitated person. Some of this testimony alleged that Mr. Ingalls transferred stock from the account he controlled as a guardian to Dora's name. While Ingalls' use of Dora as a surrogate to transfer assets was put into the court record, after his defense attorneys objected, this entire line of inquiry against Ingalls was closed down by the judge, which headed off any further questioning and testimony about any improper financial dealings related to his time as a lawyer in Boston. And it's clear to me that as a lawyer, this type of activity by Mr. Ingalls skirted all ethical rules and could have put him into even more serious legal peril. After Mrs. Ingalls' conviction, prosecutors decided against retrying Mr. Ingalls, and the charges against him were dropped. After avoiding jail time and serving her probation, the couple remained in California. They eventually moved to Santa Barbara, where they enjoyed a seemingly quiet retirement. Alfred died in 1965, and Mrs. Ingalls would live until 1972, dying at the age of 87. While it's possible that the Ingalls may have returned to Maine for one final visit after their arrest, it's pretty clear that Dora never returned to Sorrento for another summer. Dora took her $6,000 court settlement for her 40 years of psychological abuse and involuntary servitude, and went to live with her sister in St. Louis. Ironically, she died only 2 months before Bessie on March 1st, 1972. So while we'll probably never know for certain why the Engels erected the little white house overlooking the Back Bay, it we'll never know whether it was for Dora's use or for use when their family was in Sorrento, or did they build it for their children or for other guests? I like to think that if it was used by Dora, then we might take consolation that the nickname, despite its shocking origin, might be the result of a time when people in town remembered an African American woman occupying the house. Another mystery I ponder is whether Dora ever had any interactions with Louise Morel or Mother Catherine Drexel. Those sisters had spent the bulk of their fortune establishing schools and missions around the country to educate both African American and Native American youth. If Dora spent time at the house just down the block, she probably walked past the houses Louise owned many times on her way to work at Blueberry Lodge. And I wonder if some sort of intervention might have occurred much sooner if Dora had been able to make them aware of how she was being treated. Instead, Dora continued to endure years of humiliation at the hands of the Ingalls until their own daughter, Ruth, at last brought their conduct to the attention of authorities. And although Dora never visited Sorrento on vacation, I like to imagine her sitting on the porch of that little cottage for a few relaxing moments at the end of a long workday, maybe looking at the sunset, like so many others have been free to do in the decades since, and given the chance to dream about living her own life, maybe in her own way. Thanks
Thank
very much. Anyone has any questions? I'm happy to talk a little more. If not, thanks very much.
It's quite the story, Sam. It's hard to hear, but it's also very important that we acknowledge not only the contributions of African Americans during Black History Month, but of course the many wrongs perpetuated against them, and the struggles that we're still facing today. So, does anyone have any questions for Sam about Dora? DJ says, outstanding presentation. I agree. Thank you very much. It's very, yeah, it's a kind of hard to take. Uh, I guess with the recent events, it hits on a deeper level. But yes, this horrible things happened in all corners, even here in little picturesque
Quiet
Sorrento.
little down east, right?
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
All right.
All right.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much, Sam. We'll have the recorded version of this up on our YouTube channel in the next day or two for anyone that wants to go back and revisit. And we look forward to seeing you all next month. And thank you again, Sam, for a wonderful presentation.
All right. Thank you all.
Everyone have a great night.
Bye bye.
Bye. Take care.